We're now at the point where Nintendo Switch Online is technically everything that Nintendo has promised us it would be. Whether you'd like to argue any of the features have specific monetary value or if they live up to your hopes and expectations, the point stands that for a while, Nintendo has made promises about what Nintendo Switch Online was going to be, and it has now become exactly those things and just a little bit more. But now, without an official roadmap, what can we expect to come to the service that isn't there yet? Questions like, will the price stay the same? What other game consoles will come? Can Nintendo make infrastructure changes that'll improve the online gaming experiences? And what surprises might they have up their sleeves to make the service even more valuable? Let's talk about it. In the Q&A section of our podcast last week, we were asked a question about what consoles we'd expect to see on Nintendo Switch Online when it's all said and done. And it had me thinking about what I expect to see, what I want to see, and wish we'd see show up on the service. But one thought that came up in the conversation on the podcast around this question was what I mentioned earlier. Right now, we technically have everything in the Nintendo Switch Online service that Nintendo promised. It took a surprisingly long time to get to this point, but now that we've made it, we're basically in uncharted territory. Quickly looking back, the Wii U, and to a lesser extent the 3DS, had the Wii's Virtual Console to take precedence from. These were all building off that same concept with expanding libraries and a variety of games up to Nintendo 64 on the Wii U and SNES games on the new 3DSs. And although we knew this was never going to be the way Switch received retro games, we were told in the reveal event in January of 2017 basically what to expect. Although this information morphed a few times before the service's launch in September 2018, we were basically promised an online service for which we'd pay an annual fee of less than $30 that would include NES and SNES games added monthly to the service, later followed by a report of 20 SNES and NES games, seemingly total, not each. This would be accompanied by exclusive deals to the service that sounded something like straight discounts on some games. Skip forward 3 years, and here we are. Sure enough, that service launched at and has remained $20 a year. There are more than 20 total games, with over 60 NES games and so far 26 SNES ones. However, they're not dropping monthly anymore, but rather randomly and recently quite sparingly. And NSO members never did directly get discounts on games like we expected, but we were temporarily offered those $50 vouchers for select titles, as well as exclusive experiences like Tetris 99 and Kirby Super Clash, and finally, Cloud Saves, official classic stock controllers, and some other smaller bits and bobs. Okay, so that's where we are now, but where do we want to be? Well, as I said at the beginning, there's a bunch of different questions to be answered. One of these is in relation to the quality of the core service of the Nintendo Switch Online membership, the Nintendo Switch Online. And basically all the technical information I would know to answer that question comes from one man who happens to be a friend of ours here. So here's our friend, Bartholomew J. Wolfenstein IV, to answer whether or not the Switch Online itself could actually be improved.
All right, Parker, so here's the deal with Nintendo Switch's online situation. It's not as simple as some like dedicated servers or peer-to-peer connections or other buzzwords I could pull out of the air. It's just that all of Nintendo's first-party games that use their internet are developed poorly. I hate the word netcode, but they have bad netcode. PlayStation Plus and Xbox Live don't provide the netcode to all of those games. Each individual game within that service has their own development tools that make the game either work online or run like absolute garbage. So really the problem here is Nintendo themselves being bad developers. They're great. Listen, the Nintendo polish, mwah, it's beautiful. All of their games are normally amazing. But for some reason, online, it's just monkeys on typewriters. Does that analogy make sense? It's never gonna be perfect, but it could definitely be better than it is now. Right now, they rely pretty heavily on what's called input delay. You could probably tell if you've ever played Smash Bros. Online. There's a delay between the button you press and what happens on screen, and that's so that both players can react at the exact same time. It'll be an even playing field. Some games use what's called rollback, and a lot of the fighting game community really likes rollback. Rollback is what happens when you see a player kind of blip into position or move suddenly, that's the game trying to fix the delay. But this isn't ideal either, because when you use that too much, you're just gonna have everybody blipping around and then you're never gonna play anything. I'm sure if you ever played a game like Call of Duty, you've seen a situation like this happen where you're just stuttering around. At least in the way Nintendo's netcode works now, things don't jump around suddenly, they just stutter around really slowly. And if this sounds complicated, that's because it is. It's really hard to get games to work online well with seemingly no lag. But it's not impossible because we see games do it well all the time. So the solution here is, instead of Nintendo relying on a perfectly reliable connection that requires data from both parties before you can even continue to play the game, instead of that, we need some sort of blended form of a reliable connection with error correction and a little bit of rollback. Not too much so your opponent is jumping around on screen, but not too little where the game just plays like a freaking slideshow if it doesn't work right. And the error correction there is to try to guess what your next move might be. And that sounds like something you might not want in a video game, but for example, if you're running away from an opponent's move that's coming at you full speed, chances are you don't want to just stand still and take it. The game should know if it didn't get an input from you in the middle of that run, you probably want to keep running. Again, this is all, it's a lot. I have a video on why Nintendo Switch Online is so bad right now, and Parker will be so kind to leave a link to that. But also, I'll give you guys this video that explains input delay and rollback a little better than I did. Maybe Parker will have used some B-roll from that. But anyway, thanks for having me, Parker. I gotta go do nothing.
Thanks, Bobbert. And if you haven't, go ahead and check out his video from this channel already and tell him we sent you. Or he sent you, I guess. Just go check it out. Watch the video. So that's the gist of the online service itself. It sounds like on an infrastructure level, it's not going to be improved necessarily, but it could be improved within each individual game. One thought that I did have while listening to what Bob had to say is that more games should include that feature where you can see the connection of the other person you're playing against. This is something that I know is at least present in Rocket League and Mario Tennis Aces, so that at least you can choose not to have what's going to be an obviously laggy match ahead of time. All right, we're on a roll. Let's keep going. So let's answer some of those other questions now. I think it's simplest to frame this as what I expect, what I want, and what I wish would happen as I mention ideas. Starting with classic console offerings being added to the service, so far we had NES games added in 2018 and SNES games in 2019, both in September. And from there, the logical pattern would fall into one of two camps. Either they add games from the other flagship system they'd released just before the SNES, being the Game Boy, or the next home console they released, the Nintendo 64. I actually asked Twitter what they expected would come this year with the options of N64, Game Boy / Game Boy Color, or just more NES and SNES games, or literally nothing at all. And to my surprise, Game Boy and Game Boy Color combo won. I think this surprised me because the N64 is an easier marketing pitch, as it's a whole new form factor of games compared to the NES and SNES, whereas the game design for the Game Boy games falls more in line with what we already have, except you can save more often. But that said, it would be marketed off of the game library and recognizability of franchises rather than the game design itself. So as far as what I expect, up until recently, I would have easily said that N64 seemed like a shoo-in. But I am starting to wonder about the Game Boy and Game Boy Color instead. I know that to some, grouping them together may seem odd, but Nintendo clearly sees the Game Boy line as one cohesive unit with a mid-gen refresh in the Game Boy Color. So as far as expectations for this year, I would think the service price probably stays exactly the same, but we get 2 or 3 more batches of NES and SNES games between now and September, at which point we receive a fairly broad selection of 20 Game Boy line games. Funnily enough, a part of what makes me most expect this is the rumor of the Mario remakes that we heard a couple weeks ago. If Mario 64 is getting a remake, then I don't really see that as the flagship title of the N64 games coming out just before or after the standalone release. That said, that's also just a rumor, and Nintendo does weird stuff, so You tell me. But I will certainly say that the N64 would be my want for this year's edition. And not only that, but I'd like to see them add both Game Boy and N64 at the same time. Each of these could easily start with only 10 games, especially considering the N64 has a great top layer of games, but doesn't have an incredibly deep library. So if they will keep adding games for these consoles as well, they need to have good content to be able to spread out over time. And as the N64 probably has around 30, maybe 40 games that can easily be eventized, that should give them a good window to work with. Another hope of mine, though, is that they would give a bit more of a roadmap of what to expect. For a while, we received 2 to 3 NES games a month, but they got a ton of backlash for this. But the problem is, I don't think the real issue was being communicated clearly to them. Most people weren't upset about the frequency of content rather than the content itself being just NES games. So the way Nintendo is handling the rollout now may be a misguided overcorrection of what they were doing before. But as long as we would know what to expect, anything's kind of on the table. But some more borderline expectations of mine have to do with additional software and cloud streaming. In additional software, it's fairly straightforward. I'd expect another new game akin to Tetris 99 or Kirby Super Clash that's free and exclusive to NSO paying members. Last week I mentioned the idea of Balloon Battle, a battle royale balloon fight online game. But regardless of what game it is, I'd expect to see another one that fills that role this year. But the cloud streaming idea is more complex, and the expectation is that by the end of the year we could at least see more details announced on an upcoming cloud service. This has been rumored to be in conjunction with xCloud for a long time, and frankly, I think this is the answer the Switch needs when it comes to some third-party games. I don't at all expect this would be a part of the $20 a year, but would expect some bundle deals nevertheless. And if this is in partnership with xCloud, I would assume a form of Game Pass would be on the platform with a rotating Netflix-style library, rather than the Stadia model of owning licenses to games on a potentially temporary service. A lot of the questions I have, though, do rest on what the lifespan of the Switch will have been at the end. As I get into my wishes, they look longer term than just 2020, but they start now. The Wii Virtual Console was generally regarded as being paced quite well, but then the Wii U was really frustrating because it just restarted the whole cycle over again. And then it started all the way over again, and it is where we are now for the Switch. And I'm firmly in the camp that I think we'll see GameCube emulation on the Switch, but I'm guessing it's within the last 2 years or so. So if the console has a 5 or 6 year life cycle, that could be as early as 2021. But if it's more like the 3DS 8 or 9 years, then it could be a lot further out than that. My wish is that they would just tell us a bit more what to expect, especially with the obvious stuff like Nintendo 64. And the big hope for especially long term is that whatever we have by the end of the Switch life cycle will carry forward into the next console. We at fanatixfour call it the Nintendo swap, but I do assume it'll essentially be a Switch 2.0. And the value proposition of the Nintendo Switch Online wouldn't be tarnished at all to be able to carry forward, whereas the Virtual Console kind of had those issues. So hopefully they're setting themselves up for a really great long haul, but we're kind of in the painful periods right now. That said, there's a lot of room to grow, and what we see this year might paint the best picture of what we expect to see coming in the long term. But that's what I think. What do you think? Do you think we're not going to get any more games added to NSO and we're just going to be doomed to play the same games over and over and just play our backlogs till the end of time? Let me know all that and more in the comment section down below, and we'll pull a couple of those comments, bring them to our podcast that I mentioned earlier in the video. And while you're down there, leave a like on the video and subscribe to Fanatix4 and ring the bell for notifications for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern time from me and from AJ. All right, and that's about it. See you guys next time.